The moment the news segment came on, Raymond choked on his morning coffee, so hard he had to set the mug down on the marble countertop before he dropped it. On the television screen, filling the 65-inch display he had bought himself as a birthday present 2 years ago, was his ex-wife. Not the exhausted, red-eyed woman he had watched walk out of his front door, carrying one bag and a box of photographs. This was someone else entirely. This woman sat across from a morning show host, with her shoulders back and her chin level, talking about her embroidery business, the way people talked about something they had built with their own hands and loved every second of it. The lower third graphic read, Ren and Needle, founder Tessa Morrow. Raymond read it 3 times. He stood in the kitchen of the house he had kept, the house his attorney had helped him hold on to, and felt something crawl up the back of his neck that he did not want to name. 2 years ago, he had told Tessa she would never amount to anything outside of their marriage. He had said it plainly, without raising his voice, the way you state a fact to someone who needs to hear it. She had taken a single duffel bag, her grandmother's sewing kit wrapped in a flour sack towel, and left without giving him the satisfaction of a scene. Now she was on television. Raymond picked up his coffee mug, looked at the screen one more time, and threw it against the wall. Tessa had grown up in Macon, Georgia, in a house where the windows were always open because her grandmother, Ida, believed fresh air was cheaper than medicine and worked about as well. Ida had raised Tessa more or less alone after Tessa's mother left when Tessa was 4, and her father followed a job to Houston and found another family there. Neither of them left forwarding addresses. Ida never mentioned either of them with bitterness. She simply filled the space they had left with cooking smells and the low, steady sound of the television in the evenings and the particular rhythm of a sewing needle working through fabric. "Come here," Ida would say, patting the cushion beside her on the couch. "I'll show you how to do the French knot again." Tessa was never good at sitting still, but she was good at watching her grandmother's hands. The way Ida could look at a plain piece of linen and see something in it that wasn't there yet. A border of morning glories, a spray of wheat, a cardinal sitting on a bare branch, felt to Tessa like a kind of power she didn't fully understand but wanted badly to inherit. She was 17 when Ida had her first stroke. Not bad enough to put her in a facility, but bad enough to change things. Tessa started working evenings at a diner 2 miles from the house, picking up whatever shifts they would give her, riding her bike when the weather allowed, and calling a cab from the tips when it didn't. She kept Ida's garden going, because Ida had always kept it going, and she learned to cook the things Ida could no longer manage to stand long enough to make. She did not complain. This was simply the shape of her life, and she accepted it the way you accept weather. When she was 20, she met Raymond at a mutual friend's backyard cookout. He was from outside Atlanta, finishing up a graduate program in business, and he had a way of talking about the future. His future, their future, a future he seemed to be constructing out of certainty and forward momentum that Tessa found intoxicating. She had spent 3 years managing crisis and scarcity. The idea of someone who simply assumed things would work out felt like being handed something she hadn't known she was hungry for. They dated for a year. When Ida passed away that winter, quietly, in her sleep, with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the sewing kit on the nightstand, Raymond drove down from Atlanta the same day Tessa called him. He sat with her through the funeral arrangements. He helped her sort through Ida's things, though he didn't pretend to understand why Tessa wanted to keep the old metal sewing kit with its cracked leather lid and the initials ICCW pressed into the corner. "It's falling apart," he said. "I know," Tessa said. "I'm keeping it." He didn't push, not then. They married 9 months later. Tessa moved to Atlanta, left behind the house in Macon she had rented out, and then let go, and built her life around Raymond's schedule, and Raymond's ambitions, and the particular way Raymond needed things done. She worked part-time at a fabric store for the first 2 years, mostly because she couldn't stand being inside the apartment all day, and she did her embroidery in the evenings on the couch, while Raymond worked at his desk. The embroidery was not a business. It was not even a hobby she talked about much. It was just something she did, the way other people read or watched television, to quiet her mind, to feel her grandmother's hands working through her own. But over the years, Raymond's patience for small things began to wear thin. The fabric store wasn't serious enough. The embroidery was fine as a hobby, but she shouldn't get too attached to it, because she would need to be flexible when his company relocated, which it eventually did, twice, once to Nashville and then to Charlotte. She followed each time without asking him to consider what she was leaving behind, because she had told herself, this was what you did. You built a life together. You made room for each other. What she didn't fully see until much later was that she had made all the room, and Raymond had filled it. She was 29 when it started to fall apart visibly. He had been promoted, which meant longer hours and a different kind of pressure. And when he came home tired, he came home irritable, and the irritability had to go somewhere. It went toward Tessa. Not loudly. Raymond was not a loud person. He was precise. He said things like, "I don't think that's a realistic path for you, and you've been comfortable for too long." And once, on a Saturday morning when she had shown him an embroidery piece she'd been working on for 3 weeks, a detailed rendering of a magnolia branch she was genuinely proud of, he looked at it for a moment and said, "It's pretty. But pretty doesn't pay anything, Tessa." She put the piece away and didn't take it out again for 6 months. The separation, when it came, was Raymond's idea, stated as a decision rather than a conversation. He sat her down one evening after dinner, while she was still holding her napkin, and told her he had been thinking about this for a while, and he believed they had grown in different directions, and he wanted a divorce. He had already spoken to an attorney. He had already made a list of the assets. Tessa sat across from him and felt the particular stillness that comes before a very large sound. "Is there someone else?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She did not cry in front of him. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed. She had been in this house for 4 years. She had learned to love Charlotte slowly and carefully, the way you learn to love anything you didn't choose. Now she would be leaving it. Raymond's attorney had structured the asset division in a way that was technically legal and practically devastating. The house, which they had bought with a down payment that came partly from the sale of Tessa's grandmother's Macon house, was staying with Raymond because his name was primary on the deed. The joint savings account, which Tessa had contributed to faithfully for 7 years, had a number in it that was smaller than it should been, and Raymond's attorney had explanations for where the rest had gone, that Tessa's attorney, a tired man who had clearly taken her case out of sympathy more than strategy, could not effectively counter. She signed what she had to sign. She packed what was hers. Ida's sewing kit sat on the closet shelf. Raymond walked past it twice while she was packing and said nothing about it. She carried it out with both hands. The weeks after the divorce were the kind of weeks you do not describe to people because there are no words that don't sound like complaining. Tessa found a room in a shared house in a neighborhood of Charlotte she had never had a reason to visit. 3 other women, a shared kitchen that smelled permanently of someone's coconut hair products, a bathroom with a broken tile she kept meaning to ask the landlord about. She had enough money to cover 3 months of rent and food if she was careful. She had no job. She had a box of fabric scraps and Ida's sewing kit, and a laptop she had bought herself 2 years ago that Raymond had never touched because it was hers. She applied for jobs. She applied for things she was qualified for, and things she wasn't quite qualified for, and things she was desperately overqualified for. She got 3 interviews in 6 weeks. She got one offer, an administrative position at a property management company that paid less than she had made at the fabric store a decade ago. She took it. She rode the city bus to work at 7 in the morning and rode it home at 5:30 and made dinner in the shared kitchen and sat in her room in the evenings with Ida's sewing kit open on the small desk. She was not doing it for any reason. She was doing it the way she had always done it, because it was the only time during the day when her mind went quiet. One evening, about 6 weeks in, she finished a small piece she hadn't planned to finish. She had started it without thinking, working from a scrap of cream linen she'd found at the bottom of her fabric box, and what ended up on it was a honeybee, detailed enough that the individual segments of its body were visible, hovering above a small spray of lavender. She had used some of Ida's older threads. The colors were slightly faded, which she'd worked with rather than against, and the result looked not like a craft project, but like something that belonged in a frame. She photographed it against the white of her bedsheet. She posted it on an Instagram account she hadn't touched in 2 years, mostly because she had no one else to show it to. By morning it had 47 likes. By the following evening it had over 200, and 3 people had left comments asking if it was for sale. She stared at her phone for a long time. She set the price at $40 because that felt reasonable. It sold within 4 hours. Then she made another one and posted it and priced it at $50 because she had used more complex stitching on the border. That one sold too. She did not quit her job at the property management company. She was not reckless. But she started waking up an hour earlier every morning to work before her shift, and staying up an hour later at night, and spending her lunch breaks sketching designs in a small notebook she kept in her purse. She opened an Etsy shop called Wren and Needle. The wren because Ida had always kept a little ceramic wren on the kitchen windowsill, and the needle because it was honest. She priced her work carefully. She photographed everything against the same cream background, with the same soft morning light from her one window. She sold 11 pieces in her first full month, 23 in her second. Her name was Agnes, and she owned a little gift shop 2 blocks from the bus stop, where Tessa transferred every morning. Tessa had noticed the shop for weeks before she went inside. A narrow storefront, with dried flower wreaths in the window, and a handwritten sign that read "Locally made, thoughtfully chosen." She went in one Saturday in October when she didn't have to be anywhere, and spent 45 minutes looking at everything. Agnes was behind the counter, sorting through a box of tissue paper when Tessa came in, and she looked up with the expression of someone who was genuinely happy to see another person walk through her door, which Tessa found unexpectedly moving. "Take your time," Agnes said. "I'm just making a mess back here." They talked for almost an hour. Agnes had opened the shop 8 years ago after leaving a corporate marketing job that had paid well and made her miserable. She had no illusions about the business. It was hard. Margins were thin. Success was incremental. But she said all of this without despair, with a directness that Tessa found bracing and a little wonderful. Before Tessa left, she mentioned the embroidery almost by accident, the way you mention something you're not sure you're allowed to be proud of yet. Agnes asked to see it. Tessa pulled up her Instagram. Agnes looked at the screen, then looked up. "How much do you charge?" 40 to 60 mostly, depending on size. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "I could sell these. Not the Etsy ones, your own designs made for the shop. Botanical, local birds, that sort of thing." She handed the phone back. "Come back with some samples and we'll talk numbers." Tessa walked to the bus stop in the October cold, feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She came back the following Saturday with 6 pieces. Agnes bought 4 outright and took 2 on consignment. She sold all 6 by Thanksgiving. His name was Patrick. He came into Agnes's shop on a Saturday in December, while Tessa was there dropping off a new batch, and Agnes introduced them with the particular energy of someone who had thought about this introduction in advance. Patrick was Agnes's younger brother. He had moved back to Charlotte 18 months ago from Portland, where he had been working as a structural engineer. He was quiet in the way that took a few minutes to distinguish from shy. It wasn't shyness, just economy. He didn't say things unless he meant them, which Tessa noticed quickly because she had spent 7 years with someone who said things precisely when they would land hardest. She didn't trust it immediately. She would have been stupid to. But Agnes kept finding reasons for Tessa to be at the shop on Saturdays, and Patrick kept coming by to help with small repairs, a shelf bracket that had worked loose, a display case with a sticky drawer, and gradually they started talking. Not about anything significant at first, about Charlotte, about Macon, about the particular smell of old fabric and what it reminded each of them of. One afternoon he asked how long she had been doing embroidery. "Since I was about 10, she said. "My grandmother taught me." He looked at a piece she had just hung, a great blue heron standing in shallow water, worked in shades of blue-gray thread so fine they read almost like watercolor. "She must have been patient with you." "She was patient with everything," Tessa said. Then she said, "She died 6 years ago. I took her sewing kit when I left my marriage. It was the one thing I made sure I had." She hadn't meant to say all of that. It just came out, the way things do when you've been keeping them in too long. Patrick didn't tell her he was sorry in the reflexive way people did. He just looked at her for a moment and said, "That makes sense. Some things are worth protecting." She thought about that sentence for days afterward. By spring, Wren and Needle had outgrown Etsy. She had been approached by 2 other local retailers, and one shop owner in Asheville had reached out after seeing Agnes's social media. She was still working the property management job, but the math was beginning to shift. Some months the embroidery income exceeded her salary. Some months it was close. She had started teaching a small evening class at a community arts center. 8 students, beginners, 2 hours on Thursday nights, and the class had a wait list. She hired a lawyer, a good one this time. She spent an afternoon going through what she was entitled to from the divorce settlement, what she had signed away without fully understanding, what recourse she might have. The answer was not nothing. Raymond had moved assets in as her original attorney had not caught. It took 4 months and a great deal of patience, but she recovered a portion of the joint savings that was rightfully hers. It wasn't everything. It was enough to change the shape of what was possible. She quit the property management job on a Tuesday in April, took herself to lunch at a diner 3 blocks from Agnes's shop, and ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, which was a club sandwich and a slice of pie. She sat there for an hour in the afternoon quiet and felt for the first time in years that she was living in a life that was actually hers. The sewing kit was in her bag. It went everywhere with her. The television segment came about because a freelance journalist who wrote for a regional lifestyle publication had come into Agnes's shop in January looking for a Valentine's Day gift, ended up buying one of Tessa's pieces, and had been thinking about it ever since. She called the shop in March, asking if the artist would be willing to be interviewed for a piece about craftswomen building small businesses in Charlotte. Tessa said yes. The article ran in May. It was longer than she expected and kinder than she deserved, she thought, though Agnes told her to stop saying that. A producer from a morning television program in Charlotte read the article. She called Tessa directly. The segment aired on a Thursday. They filmed in Agnes's shop, which made the most sense visually, and Tessa wore her grandmother's sewing kit on the table beside her like it was supposed to be there, because it was. The host asked her what it had been like to start over with nothing, and Tessa said, "I didn't have nothing. I had what my grandmother gave me. That turned out to be enough." The producer had asked her beforehand if she wanted them to blur her last name for privacy. She said no. She wanted her full name on the screen. Tessa Morrow, founder, Ren and Needle. She wanted it to be findable. Raymond saw the segment at 7:43 in the morning. He was in Charlotte still, in the house he had fought to keep, and he had turned on the local news while he was making coffee, which he did every morning, and there she was. He read the lower third 3 times. He had not thought about Tessa seriously in over a year. He had told himself the story of their marriage as a story of incompatibility, of 2 people who wanted different things, which was true enough that he had never needed to examine it more carefully. He had moved on. There had been a woman in his building for several months, and then there hadn't been. And lately he preferred not to think about that either. He picked up his coffee mug and threw it at the wall because the alternative was standing there with the feeling that was moving through him, which he did not want to name and could not stop feeling. He drove to the shop that afternoon without fully deciding to. He told himself he was in the neighborhood. He was not in the neighborhood. The shop was busier than he expected. He had to wait near the door while 2 other customers were being helped. Tessa was behind the counter and she saw him before he spoke. Her expression didn't change the way he had expected it to. "Raymond," she said. "Tessa." He looked around the shop. He had expected something smaller, more tentative. "I saw the segment this morning." "I know," she said. "I put my full name on it." He wasn't sure what to do with that. "I wanted to come by and I thought maybe we could talk." She looked at him with an evenness that he recognized from the early years of their marriage and had not seen in the later ones. "What would we talk about?" "I think I made some mistakes," he said. He had practiced something longer on the drive over, but standing in front of her now, with Patrick coming through the back door of the shop, carrying a repaired shelf bracket, and stopping when he saw the scene, the longer speech had gone somewhere he couldn't reach it. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know you did, so did I." She set down the piece of fabric she had been holding. "I stayed longer than I should have. I let you tell me what I was worth and I listened. That's mine to carry." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm not going back to any of it. Not to the conversation. Not to the accounting of it. I've already moved forward." Raymond looked at Patrick, who had set the bracket down quietly and was waiting near the back without trying to make himself invisible. He looked at Tessa. He looked at the framed embroidery pieces on the walls of the shop, the heron, the honeybees, a small winter sparrow on a frosted branch. And he understood, with a clarity that came too late, that she had been making these things the whole time they were together. He had just never looked. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said, because it was the only true thing he could think of. "Thank you," she said. She meant it, and she didn't. He left. On the drive home, he stopped at a red light 2 blocks from the shop and sat there when the light turned green, because the car behind him hadn't honked yet, and he wasn't ready to move. His investment portfolio, which he had been convinced was his backup security, had lost a significant portion of its value over the past 8 months due to decisions he had made while confident and stopped paying close attention to after. His company had restructured in February, and his position was not gone but changed, smaller. The house had 3 empty bedrooms and cost more to heat than made sense for one person. He had spent 9 years with Tessa. 9 years of her waking up early and keeping things running and following him from city to city and asking for nothing that he took seriously. He had attributed their stability to his own effort because that was easier than recognizing how much of it had been hers. The car behind him honked. He drove. The commission came in October. A museum gift shop in Raleigh had found Ren and Needle through the article and wanted an exclusive collection. 12 original pieces for the holiday season, botanical and regional wildlife themes, framed and ready to hang. The number they offered for the commission was 4 times what Tessa had made in her best month on Etsy. She called Agnes from the parking lot after she got off the phone, and Agnes screamed into her ear so loudly that Tessa had to hold the phone away from her face, and then she sat in her car for a few minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, not quite crying, not quite not crying. She opened her bag and took out the sewing kit. The leather was more cracked than it had been. The clasp didn't close quite right anymore. She ran her thumb over the initials, ICW, and thought about her grandmother's hands and how Ida had looked at a plain piece of fabric and seen what it could become. She had promised herself, in those first bad weeks in the shared house, that she would come back to who she was before she had let someone else define her. She had not known exactly who that was. She was still figuring it out. But she knew she was closer now than she had ever been. Patrick proposed on a Saturday evening in March, a year and a half after they met, in Agnes's shop after closing time, which was Agnes's doing more than his, though he hadn't minded. The ring was simple. He knew Tessa well enough by then to know that simple was right, and he asked her with the same economy he brought to everything, directly and without theater, sitting across from her at the little table near the window where she sometimes did her sketching. She said yes. Then she laughed because Agnes made a noise from the back room that suggested she had been listening the entire time. At the wedding the following September, Tessa wore her grandmother's gold earrings and carried Ida's sewing kit in her bag through the whole day, the way she carried it everywhere. During the ceremony, she looked down at her hands for a moment, the callus on her right index finger from years of pulling thread, the small scar on her left thumb from a needle slip when she was 12, and thought that her grandmother would have known exactly what to say about this day, in that plain, unhurried way she had of saying exactly what was true. "You kept going" is probably what Ida would have said. "That's all I asked," she had.